Hello everyone, and welcome to the Stress Reduction Project. Today's webinar will cover social isolation and how it's a natural stress response. So my name is Nadalyn Reyes, and I'm an MSW intern at Fresno City College.
Hello, my name is Enrique Mercado, and I'm also an MSW intern at Fresno City College.
And we would like to thank you all for joining us today. And so we would like to begin. Before we get started, we would like to conduct a quick poll to examine if you currently feel like you're experiencing symptoms of social isolation. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer that poll. Okay, so it looks like the results show that most of you do agree that you are experiencing symptoms of social isolation. Okay, and we'd like to thank you all for participating in that poll. So I think it's safe to say that being connected to others socially is a fundamental human need. It makes us feel safe, supported, and appreciated to be around others and to have people to regularly interact with. However, oftentimes many of us may use social isolation as a natural coping mechanism when we feel stressed or burnt out. And it's a very natural response to choose to isolate oneself from daily activities, your work responsibilities, and those we share meaningful connections with. And we all want some peace and quiet after a long, hard day. And many of us just want to be alone when things get challenging. I know I need that at times. However, we don't want it to begin, or we don't want social isolation to become an unhealthy coping strategy. And since the start of COVID-19, social isolation has taken on a new meaning for many of us. So in this presentation, you'll learn more about social isolation, the effects of social isolation, and identifying healthier coping strategies instead of social isolation. So we can define social isolation as the lack of social contacts and having few people to interact with regularly. So it's the state of complete or near complete lack of interactions, contact, and relationships between an individual and others. It is a phenomenon that is unique to each individual and their experience. Some researchers also define social isolation in a more structured manner, so describing it as an objective and quantifiable reflection of the paucity of one's social contacts and then the reduced size of their social network. And then some of you may have answered the poll at the beginning of this presentation, feeling maybe a little bit confused about symptoms of social isolation and what they are. So I would like to go over those right now. So some symptoms of social isolation include feelings of depression and anxiety, aggressive behavior, a passive attitude, poor sleep quality, and altered memory, poor self-care or self-neglect. You're experiencing deep boredom or have a general lack of interest and withdrawal. You're also losing interest in your personal hygiene, poor eating and nutrition, and you may be experiencing significant disrepair, clutter, or hoarding in your house. So social isolation, it ranges from a voluntary isolate, so one who seeks disengagement from social interactions and intercourses, to those whose isolation is involuntary or imposed by others. Social isolation, as I've said, it's very natural and it may be good for you in moments to decompress for a little bit. However, social isolation does become a problem when it's involuntary. Social isolation, it typically affects older adults due to changes in their health and social connections, and just changes that come from getting older. And they may be experiencing hearing or vision or memory loss. They may be experiencing trouble getting around or having an experience losing friends or family. It also typically affects those with chronic conditions as well. And in a few slides, I'll go over those who are more at risk for social isolation. And components of social isolation can include gender, marital status, socioeconomic status, demographics, and general family factors. And social isolation can lead to loneliness, but loneliness is not necessarily a condition of social isolation. So it's important to recognize and remember that both can exist separately. And loneliness can be defined as the distressing feeling of being alone or separated. So, an example is that you can live alone and not feel lonely or socially isolated, and you can feel lonely while being with other people. And then social isolation can result in either a reactive or chronic loneliness. So, reactive loneliness occurs during a life transition. So, this would be if you are experiencing divorce, a death, or a sudden move. And reactive loneliness eases with time. Chronic loneliness sets when individuals don't have the emotional, mental, or financial resources to get out and satisfy their social needs, or they may lack a social circle or support system. So there's a concept that social isolation can occur at four layers of the social concept. So your outermost layer is community, so where one feels integrated or isolated from the larger social structure. Next is the layer of the organization. So this would be one's school, your work, your churches, anything you feel a part of in an organization. The following layers, those that are closest to the individual, such as your friends, your family, significant others. And then the innermost layer is the person. So the one that has the personality, the intellectual ability, or the senses to interpret relationships. So it's important to consider these layers to identify your social isolation, as it could just be one or two of them, and you'll have to consider the potential impact of isolation on the other layers. It's also important to identify exactly where you feel you need to isolate yourself and start asking yourself why you're feeling this way and what can you do instead of self-isolating. And as I mentioned earlier, that social isolation typically affects older adults and those with disabilities or chronic conditions. You may also be at greater risk for social isolation if you happen to live alone, or you can't leave your home, you have a fear of leaving your home, you had a major loss or life change, such as a death of a spouse or partner, significant other, or you're going through retirement, you're struggling with your money and finances, you take care of others, you're having psychological or cognitive challenges or experiencing mental health issues such as depression, you have a limited social support, you are having trouble with your hearing, vision, you live in a rural, unsafe, or hard to reach neighborhood, and you're experiencing language barriers where you live, and you're also experiencing age, racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, and or gender identity discrimination where you live. And also you're not meaningfully engaged in activities or you feel a lack of purpose. So I also want to highlight that social isolation and culture are often linked as well, such as cultural groups not assimilating into the dominant culture. And as I stated earlier, language barriers or differences. Many immigrants are unable to join or find support networks, which make them more at a risk for social isolation. And many ethnic and religious groups and communities here in the US, they value community closeness, family kinship, social communication, and geographic proximity. So not being able to access those, such as community closeness or geographic proximity, may result in social isolation. So before I go show this video, it's just a quick 5-minute video on social isolation and its effects on student mental health. And I also want to use it as an intro for my next slide. We all know that students have been greatly impacted by COVID-19, And this video shows students' perspectives attending UT Austin. And I'm sure the students' feelings in this video and their perspectives are very similar to the feelings that students here at FCC are feeling. And I'm sure faculty and staff are able to relate as well. And though we are slowly phasing out of a 100% online format for school, many of us are still having to process and work through the feelings we felt while being isolated away from work or FCC's campus.
The pandemic has significantly affected how students interact with one another due to stay-at-home and social distancing orders. However, lessened social interaction during quarantine has raised concerns about how greater isolation can negatively impact mental health and increase suicidal risk.
Something that I worry about for all of us is, are students able to maintain their social connections and feeling connected to a community?
The pandemic has taken a significant toll on college students' mental health. According to a study done by the Healthy Minds Network and the American College Health Association, risk for suicide among college students increased from last fall to the beginning of the pandemic in March. Along with this, feelings of anxiety and depression significantly increased and impaired academic performance in the early months of the pandemic.
I genuinely really enjoy the part of class where you get to meet people, and like the study group, just that in person where you get to meet that person and be like, hey, will you sit with me next class?
Time is just like not acting the way that it usually does for me. I feel like the days are blurring together, but they're also much longer. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I just go and sit on my couch now. Can't go to like the PCL, or like going to the park with friends still feels kind of like I'm doing something I shouldn't be.
Since the pandemic and since being at home all the time, you feel a little bit lonely. Even though you're close to your family, mentally, it's a little bit hard. I want to see my friends just really bad back on campus, and I miss being with people in general.
There is much concern about how increased social isolation can heighten feelings of anxiousness, stress, or prolonged thoughts about suicidal ideation, since isolation is one of the risk factors for suicide.
Since being home, there's so much time to just think. And with time to think comes that tendency to overthink, and you get anxiety, and you just, this has been my experience, but it's just all those feelings of what am I doing, but super amplified because of quarantine. And so that has definitely taken a toll on my mental health.
Usually when I have like strong suicidal urges, it helps to go do something, like, take a walk or something, listen to music. But I'm stuck inside my room.
I get a few panic attacks sometimes. I've had panic attacks before, but more so since the pandemic. I just miss my friends.
Now more than ever, students are looking for new ways to connect and take care of their mental health during a time when it is being significantly challenged.
I think many of us are spending a lot of time on screens. So offering yourself the ability to shut your laptop and get off of a screen as much as, or when you can, going outside and spending time in nature, moving your body. We are being very sedentary right now. I know I certainly am.
We're all in that same space where things feel a little bit bleak. Making that first move and reaching out to a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. Anyone, whether it's family or friends, maybe professors that you've, built a relationship with. And if none of the above, then journaling is always a great way, I think, talking to yourself out loud.
A lot of what I've been watching have been comedy movies, just because I want to laugh.
Time goes by so fast, and you never know what's going to happen. letting people know that you appreciate them and you cherish them is so important.
In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the UT Counseling and Mental Health Center has transitioned its services online to make mental health resources more accessible for students.
We're able to offer all of our services, and we're offering them via telehealth, by video, and in some cases phones. Some students prefer phone. So we're able to offer group counseling, short-term individual counseling, psychiatric and medication management services, and workshops, some additional groups and workshops that are specific to coping with COVID, private spaces for telehealth appointments. So we recognize that not every student has a private space or lives in a place where they feel comfortable doing counseling. They're worried about people overhearing. So we do provide private offices for students to have their telehealth appointments in, and we have some extended hours as well.
They have therapy sessions at UT, which I'm glad that they have it. A lot of people suggested this since I've been to college. And after 3 years of people saying, hey, you should go to therapy, I'm like, okay, fine. It really does work.
Okay, so that video was able to talk about how their school was able to serve them online, and FCC was able to do the same for our students and continue to do so by providing services online and in person. And just as I was saying earlier before I showed the video, a lot of students, I believe, have felt the same as those students in the video, and they're continuing to work through those feelings, even having to go back on campus as well. And so social isolation during COVID-19. So as I said, COVID-19 has definitely impacted our lives since the beginning. It's changed our daily routines, feelings of loneliness. It's changed our nation's education at all levels. And it increased our feelings of loneliness and grief and loss. Early on, the pandemic brought on public panic, concerns of illness, and increased stress. However, it also brought on a new meaning of social isolation for many of us. And the social isolation we experienced was abrupt instead of slow and developing. And we didn't know how long we would have to isolate ourselves from work and friends and family. Students and employees had to adapt quickly to working from home and doing school online. And even today, some of us are having to still adjust to returning back to our offices, or still working remotely, or having to adjust to a new hybrid of both in-person and online work. And even though social distancing and having to quarantine were necessary to prevent the spread of the virus, it led to elevated levels of social isolation and loneliness and other mental health issues. And in the video, it did mention how suicide is a risk for social isolation. And in a survey here in the US, it found that COVID-related mental health problems and social isolation were definitely associated with thoughts of self-harm and even suicide during the first months of the pandemic. So it definitely highlights the need for more mental health services in schools and colleges and universities, especially regarding social isolation. And so the effects of social isolation include poor cardiovascular function, increased risk to be inactive or a diminished physical activity, motor decline, impaired cognitive functions, a weakened immune function, dementia, higher odds of mental health problems, poor sleep quality or daytime dysfunction, and an increase in alcohol consumption or smoking, and an increased risk of premature death. And so I wanted to include this figure from an advocacy brief from the World Health Organization, or the WHO. I think it organizes the effects and consequences better. And I also want to highlight at the bottom how social isolation and loneliness can impact our economy as well. And so the health conditions, as I mentioned, were diabetes, depression, anxiety, dementia, poor diet, and suicide, elder abuse, and economic costs with healthcare and long-term care. So social isolation and loneliness do appear to impose a heavy financial burden on our society. And in the US, it was estimated that 6.7 billion in annual federal spending has been attributed to social isolation among older adults. And so we want to make sure you are able to prevent the consequences of social isolation and choose healthier coping strategies and responses instead of social isolation. So now Enrique will cover healthier coping strategies.
Hello again. In the next part of the presentation, I'll be discussing about some of the dangerous coping tools that contribute to our stress and become detached from our friends, family, and ultimately resulting in us being socially isolated. I will also be talking about some healthy coping mechanisms to help combat social isolation. Next slide, please. So one example of an unhealthy coping mechanism is using alcohol or any other substance that are used to either dull or numb the pain away. However, this effect may dull the pain. It's only temporary. And furthermore, it does not help solve the problem, but in fact, it even makes it worse. We start doing more, and as we do more, we start to isolate ourselves from our friends and family because we don't want to hear the positive feedback and trying to help us get better. And then the worst part is that as we do more, we become addicts. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next, I'm going to be talking about overeating and undereating and how this can create an unhealthy relationship with food. It can cause harm to ourselves by overfilling ourselves, and these effects can be things like obesity, high cholesterol, or diabetes. And same goes for undereating. It has its effects on individuals as well. It can cause an imbalanced diet. People can get ill more, develop skin problems, or even have anemia. Next slide, please. Can you go back to the slide? I'm so sorry about that. Thank you. Next, I'm going to talk about social media and how we tend to, interact more on these social platforms such as Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, or we even try to work more hours or spend more time on the television or spend more time sleeping. And these are all things that we do to distract us. However, again, this is a temporary solution to solve a problem. Doing this in the process further withdraws us from society. In the process, we may feel overwhelmed and even possible decreased energy to interact with others. However, when we interact with others, with other people, such as our friends or family, it creates an uplifting feeling. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next, I want to talk about self-harm. Now, this is one of the most dangerous, unhealthy coping mechanisms. And if you're feeling any thoughts or feelings, I encourage you to please seek professional help immediately. One of the most important things to remember is that we all face stress and our difficulties in our lives. However, using healthy coping mechanisms to combat the stress that helps push us towards isolation is the first step toward combating, us feeling the stress and then ultimately resulting in social isolation. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next, I'm going to be talking about developing healthy coping tools to combat social isolation. One technique I would like to introduce is called box breathing. And how this technique goes is we breathe in for 4 seconds, Hold your breath for 4 seconds. Then breathe out for 4 seconds. And hold your breath for 4 seconds. Repeating this several times helps slow down breathing. It helps decrease heart rate, and it activates the calming response. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, I'm gonna talk about another technique to help combat social isolation. But this time, I want you to join me. So I'm gonna give you some time. I just want you to find somewhere where you can calmly think in your head. So I'll go ahead and give you some time. Okay, so this technique is called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. Now, first, in your head, I want you to list 5 things you can see. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you some time. Okay, now I want you to think about 4 things you can feel. Next, I want you to think about 3 things you can hear. Now, I want you to think about 2 things you can smell. And then lastly, I want you to think about 1 thing you can taste. Okay, I hope all of you guys are feeling a lot more calmer, a lot less stress. Now, this technique was developed to help a person to be present in the moment. It also helps slow down the racing thoughts that go through our heads when we're experiencing stressful moments in our life. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about exercise. It really doesn't matter what kind you get. It just matters that you get active. Now, having exercise in your life, it promotes many benefits. First, it floods the body with endorphins. It also helps you use the adrenaline released from the stress. In addition, it also clears out our heads and calms us down. Sometimes we are just so overwhelmed with stress that we don't realize the negative effects. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another healthy coping tool to combat social isolism is having a journal or diary. Writing down how you feel or feeling about certain things, this helps us acknowledge how you feel. And in addition to that, it allows us to plan out possible solutions. It helps us tune into our thoughts and feelings. It helps us come up with an action plan for ourselves. And as a result of that, it even promotes a better self-esteem. It also helps us for the future to reference back what worked for you best. Next slide, please. Next, I'm gonna be talking about how taking a break from technology is another great way of is a coping tool to combat social isolation. By practicing this, it helps you focus on your immediate surroundings, to be more in tune with your own feelings. And most importantly, it helps us connect live with others. Spending time with family and friends is another great way. This helps us feel calmer and less overwhelmed by our circumstances, and helps develop social networking. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about gratitude. This is another example of a way to combat social isolation. When something's upsetting us, it helps us to be grateful for the things we have in our lives, and not just focus on the things that we're not going our way or we don't have. Another thing I would like to introduce is acts of kindness. Performing acts of kindness, it flutters our body with feel-good hormones. It increases our senses of connectedness and purpose. It helps us focus on the problems other than our own. Next slide, please. I'm now going to be talking about identifying support systems during times of stress. We often find that life is a lot more easier when you don't have to go at it alone. It's helpful to identify the people in your life that support you and focus on strengthening those relationships. Also, natural support systems. These are people in our lives who are available and care about us. And if we reach out, they can help. And these can be formal support systems, such as staff at your school. It can be a social worker, counselor, teacher, or any other professional. It may be a placement worker who is assigned to a family, or a permanent worker assigned to a child placed with you. Or it can even be a therapist assigned to a family or other services provided. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about informal support. And these could be people in your family, friends, or it can be a support group. You could also be a part of their support system too. A good relationship is when people support one another. This helps build each other up when they are down. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to be talking about understanding one's own strength in times of stress. One way to do this is by practicing self-compassion. When you practice self-compassion, you're allowing yourself to realize that it's okay and that you're human. And being human means that we all make mistakes and we all experience struggle. It also helps us stop what we are doing and reflect. Sure, things don't always go our way. So we always hear that one saying, don't cry over spilled milk. I remember as a kid, me wanting a candy or a toy and me not getting my way and me throwing a tantrum and crying. My mom would always tell me, are you hurt? Are you hungry, cold, or hot? If you're not any of these things, then you're okay. You're upset because you're not getting what you want, but you have everything you need. So in often situations, we find ourselves frustrated or we're even aggravated in times of a loss, when we don't get our way, or when we experience bumps in the road, or we've been falling short of our own ideals. And even this can result in us feeling shameful and even lead back to social isolation. This is all the more reason why it's important for us to practice self-compassion. Another important thing to realize is that no human is immune to health issues, to financial crises, or to a family member who has passed away. However, some of us are dealing with these challenges every day, which makes it even more important for a person to practice safe coping mechanisms to deal with stress. Next slide, please. Thank you. So next, I'm going to be talking about 3 parts to the self-compassion. And the first one is the term kindness. Now, this is defined as a quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. The next term I want to introduce you to is called common humanity. And this can be defined as understanding how unpleasant feelings or unpleasant feeling are a part of the human experience, as well as suffering is universal. And then another term is mindfulness. And this can be defined as a quality of one being aware of the present moment, while clearly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why is this important? Well, if you don't stop now and intervene upon your stressful life, it can create stress on other people and the ones you really care about and you love. This can be your friends, family, and coworkers. In order for you to find your strength, you must focus on you and what you're good at. Focus on your own qualities that make you unique. Next slide, please. Lastly, before I end my part of the presentation, I want to share with everybody a quote that helps me during stressful times. And it goes something like this. We often look at the mountains we still need to climb. However, we forget that the ones we have already climbed were just as challenging. Next slide, please.
So on this slide, we have further resources on social isolation. If you're interested in getting more knowledge about it, we included articles, videos, TED Talk, a list of books about isolation and loneliness. And UCLA actually put out a loneliness scale if you're interested in taking it. So this will be posted in the chat. And then if you have further questions about social isolation or questions about the MSW interns, the coordinators are listed here, their email addresses, and then Enrique and my email address and phone numbers are listed there as well. And then this will be also posted in the chat. Okay, so now we have some time for any questions. If you have any, feel free to type them in the chat or the Q&A section of Zoom.
Not seeing any questions, and there's no hands raised. But Sandy Edwards says, great job and great information. So if you want to go ahead and wrap it up.
So thank you, Sandy, and thank you everyone else for joining us and participating in our webinar with us. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.